So my presentation is titled The Use and Abuse of Psychoanalysis in Philosophy. And as I'm sure many of you have heard me mention a few times in class now, I'm a doctoral student in the philosophy department. So I wanted to do something on the way in which philosophy and philosophers have used psychology in their work. And I decided to go with psychoanalysis in part because it's an interest of mine, and also in part because Freud and psychoanalysis exercised a massive influence over philosophy in the 20th century. It became a really important part of a lot of the different movements in philosophy. So what I'm going to do today is just go through, I think, roughly 5 or 6 different schools in the 20th century, schools of philosophy, and look at the way in which they either attempted to integrate Freudian concepts with aspects of philosophy and philosophical thought, or offered some sort of critique of Freud and of psychoanalysis. So let's begin. The first school I'm going to look at is referred to as the Frankfurt School. The Frankfurt School was founded in 1923. It was founded by a group of Jewish Marxist intellectuals, and it was an interdisciplinary group of people. So it was founded by a group of economists, sociologists, psychologists, philosophers, and it was really founded on the heels of World War I and as a response to what had happened in the lead up to World War I and during World War I in Germany. So a lot of the intellectuals who were involved with the Frankfurt School were especially concerned with interrogating why Germany had become so conservative leading up to World War I and why so many people within Germany had supported really conservative regimes that had decided to launch the war. And then as the school carried forward, and as you'll notice here, I have kind of a question mark on the end date, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But as the school carried on into the middle part of the 20th century, it was also concerned with the rise of the Nazi regime and also the question of why German citizens and Austrian citizens were supporting fascism. And so as I mentioned, I have a little question mark here as to when the movement ended. I put the 1960s because that's when most of the major texts from the first generation of the Frankfurt School were published, was up through the 1960s. The school is technically referred to as the Frankfurt Institute for Social Research. It still exists today. In fact, the director of the school is at Columbia. His name is Axel Honneth. He's in the philosophy department. I think he splits his time between New York and Germany. So the school still exists today. It's gone through several different iterations. But kind of the first generation, which is the one that was most involved with combining psychoanalysis with Marxism, really did most of its work from the 20s through the 60s. So here I'm just going to single out 3 of the figures from the Frankfurt School who are most engaged with Freudian psychoanalysis and who attempted to integrate psychoanalytic concepts into the work that they were doing. So these are Theodor Adorno, Herbert Marcuse, and Erich Fromm. And I'll talk a little bit about each of them as I go, but of course I don't have time for exhaustive biographies. But yeah, each of these figures was in some way trying to take concepts from Freudian psychoanalysis and combine it with their general kind of Marxist projects, and thought that Freud had something to offer the work that they were doing. So I've highlighted 3 different ways in which they tried to do this, though of course there are more. But I think these are relatively good examples of what they were up to and gives a kind of sense of what the projects were about. So one of the first ways was attempting to combine Marx's account of ideology with concepts from Freudian psychology. So in the traditional Marxist account of ideology, Marx had identified what he considered to be the 2 main classes, the 2 main social groups, and those are the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. So the bourgeoisie is defined by Marx as the people who own the means of production. So they own land, they own factories, they own buildings, they own anything which is able to reproduce capital. And the second group, the proletariat, are those people who work for the bourgeoisie. So they're people who go into work every day, who get paid a wage. They're people who have to pay a rent in order to live. So they're people who don't own the means of production. They merely work for the people who own the means of production. So one of the problems that Marx ran into when he was trying to give his account of these 2 different classes was, the fact that the bourgeoisie clearly makes up a significantly smaller portion of the population than the proletariat. The proletariat is, of course, a huge class. It's most people. So a question Marx raised was, why doesn't the proletariat rise up and overthrow the bourgeoisie and seize the means of production? And Marx's answer to this question was that the proletariat is under this way of ideology. And what this means is that the proletariat has internalized beliefs about the social system that they live in, which help to maintain the status quo and prevents them from engaging in revolutionary activity. So one of the famous examples of this that Marx gives is meritocracy. So Marx says that the proletariat has been sort of deceived into believing that if they work hard enough and if they do well enough at their job, that they will eventually rise up the social ladder and make their way to the top and one day join the higher class. And of course, we know statistically that this isn't true, that most people don't experience significant upward mobility. There are probably some cases where this happens. I mean, of course, there's some cases where this happens, and this helps to sustain these beliefs. But ultimately, Marx describes this as a kind of false consciousness. It's a set of beliefs that we hold which help to keep the two classes in place. So Marx also considered religion to be a form of ideology. This was just something that he thought the masses had kind of internalized as a way of, making peace with their situation. So that was kind of the general Marxist picture of ideology. And so what the Frankfurt School theorists thought Freudian psychoanalysis had to offer them was this theory of the unconscious that gave a kind of psychic support or psychic structure to how these beliefs became internalized. So even though Marx had maybe given a social analysis of how this worked, we didn't yet have a kind of account of how this works at the individual level of the psyche. But Freud's concept of the unconscious allows or gives us a way to think about how it is that people can be acting on beliefs that they don't fully understand or beliefs that have been internalized but are not fully available to conscious awareness. So there's kind of an attempt to show how the unconscious could, help support this Marxist theory of ideology. The Marxist theory of ideology has undergone several revisions, and contemporary scholars have reformed it in a lot of ways, and I'll talk about that a little bit more, and it actually comes up in the video that is part of the assigned readings. But that's sort of one way in which these theorists tried to merge these two fields. The second way in which they saw psychoanalysis as helping to inform their work was in their studies on authoritarianism. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, one of the major concerns of the Frankfurt School was how should we understand the way in which people seem to will their own subjugation? Why is it that the masses continuously vote for regimes that don't seem to have their best interests in mind? Why are they voting for people like Hitler? Why are they supporting people like Hitler? Why is fascism spreading throughout Europe? When again, it doesn't seem to be in their best interests. So Erich Fromm wrote this book, Escape from Freedom, in which he tried to respond to this question and tried to argue that freedom requires a certain amount of responsibility, and people are uncomfortable with this kind of responsibility, so they sort of allow somebody else to take that place for them. Adorno, who was both a philosopher and a sociologist, ran a study, actually a sociological study, which he then published in 1950 called The Authoritarian Personality, in which he attempted to identify certain personality traits that would lead people to vote for fascistic politicians. But one of the ways in which they saw psychoanalysis informing this conversation was by looking at Freud's concept of the superego. So later in his life, Freud had written a number of political works. One of those was Group Psychology and the Analysis of the Ego. And there, Freud had argued that, while in his earlier analyses, he described the superego as a function that was ascribed to the father, there were ways in which group formations would allow people to kind of cathect their libidinal energy in some sort of external father figure, like a politician or a church leader or some sort of leader of a group who could then take the place of the superego and direct the conscience of a massive group of people. So they saw some resources in Freud's later political works for trying to think through why it was that people were allowing their moral conscience to be kind of supplanted by these authoritarian leaders. So that was another way in which they saw psychoanalysis informing their work. The last one is a little bit more specific to Herbert Marcuse. So Herbert Marcuse published a book in 1955, Eros and Civilization, in which he attempted to argue through Freud's concept of the pleasure principle and the reality principle, what Freud had called the two principles of mental functioning. He attempted to argue that Essentially, we have these two different functions in our mental life, one in which we have pleasure-seeking drive, we have libido, we have eros, this drive which drives us towards gratification. And on the other hand, we have this reality principle, which takes the form of our superego, which puts limits and imposes self-control on us. And again, in Freud's later work, he had kind of turned towards um, a more political function of the superego. So in Civilization and Its Discontents, Freud had tried to describe why it is that people seem to organize themselves in ways that restrict their pleasure-seeking behavior. And there he had argued that, if people were just out fulfilling their needs and satisfying their desires, civilization would not be able to function. We wouldn't be able to work together harmoniously. So society has to impose these kinds of strict regulations that govern behavior in order for civilization to get along. So what Marcuse tried to do in Eros and Civilization was combine Freud's analysis of the principles of mental functioning with a Marxist account of uh, of capitalism and the way in which capitalism controls and regulates behavior to get us to perform a specific kind of function that's beneficial to society. So what Marcuse tried to do is say Freud's notion of the reality principle can be construed as a performance principle, as a way in which capitalism makes demands on us to perform our jobs, to live up to its expectations. And this is really a problem of scarcity. And on Marcuse's account, this might actually be overcome one day when we develop enough technology so that we don't have to organize our society around, manual labor. Technology will be able to help us alleviate the burden of manual labor, and we'll be able to fully express our libido. We'll be able to fully operate in accordance with the pleasure principle, and we won't have to live under a repressed society. So for Marcuse, liberation was synonymous with sexual liberation. It was synonymous with overcoming capitalism. Capitalism was really the thing that was standing in the way of kind of full expression of our most primordial desires. So this text had a profound influence in the 1960s on the sexual revolution. Marcuse actually was a professor at the University of California, San Diego. All of these scholars had to flee Germany in the 1930s when Hitler began coming to power. So the Frankfurt School was actually moved to Columbia University at first, and then several of the scholars who were working in the Frankfurt School eventually moved to California. So Adorno did this, and Marcuse did this as well. And so Marcuse was in California during a lot of the student protests and during the 1960s, during the sexual revolution. And this became a kind of seminal text of the sexual revolution and inspired a lot of young scholars, like Angela Davis was one of his students who went on to publish a lot of famous work on race and on the prison system. So this is kind of how a kind of summary of how it is that these early Frankfurt School theorists were trying to integrate Marxism and Freudian psychoanalysis. The next school I'm going to talk about is the logical positivists. I'm going to spend the least amount of time on this school just because they had the least amount of engagement with Freud, though they did have a member who produced one of the most famous criticisms of Freud, Karl Popper. Though Charlene has already covered Popper's criticism a little bit in her presentation, so I'm going to move through this relatively quickly. But the logical positivists were a group of mostly scientists and mathematicians who were also trained in philosophy, primarily based out of Vienna, who had their most kind of active and productive period from the 20s, mostly through the 40s and 50s, but it did carry on into the 60s a little bit. But mostly a group of scientists and mathematicians in Vienna who were actually engaged in an attempt to end philosophy, or end what might be called speculative philosophy, which is philosophy which is trying to say something about the natural world and which thinks it can make significant or substantial claims about the natural world. So the logical positivists had been, I guess, in some sense, pretty impressed or enamored with the progress that science had made in the 19th and early 20th centuries, and really believed that the day of philosophy had kind of come and passed. So they formulated this principle, which was to guide the movement and which defined the movement, which was the principle of empirical confirmation. So according to the positivists, the only things that really made sense, or the only claims that really had any bearing on reality, were those claims which could be empirically confirmed. And what this meant was that science, through empirical confirmation, was really the dominant form of knowledge, and really the only form of knowledge. and that philosophy, when it was engaged in whatever kind of work it was doing, when it was coming up with concepts, was generally misguided and was kind of just engaged in metaphysical speculation that wasn't grounded in reality. So the positivists were really interested in shifting the focus onto science and claimed that philosophy, at its best, could just be a kind of handmaiden to the sciences. So what it could do is clarify concepts that science was using and make sure that science wasn't making any mistakes in the concepts it was using. But really, it was the scientists who were going to be producing the important or the real knowledge of the natural world. Of course, one of the most famous people in this movement is Karl Popper. And Popper is famous just as much for his participation in this movement as for his criticism of this movement. So in 1939, Popper produced this study called The Logic of Scientific Discovery, in which he showed that what the logical positivists were using as their fundamental principle, this empirical confirmation, or this principle of empirical confirmation, in fact didn't work. So what he claimed was that all science is really able to do, or what all empirical science is able to produce, is it can produce falsifications. So it can show that something is not true. So when we make an observation, we can eliminate potential hypotheses, or we can show that certain hypotheses are untenable or don't match our observations. But this doesn't mean that we can actually confirm any of our hypotheses. So I think Dr. Madsen, when he was talking about Popper earlier in the semester, used the example of swans. Just because we observe a number of white swans in our studies, that doesn't mean that the next swan is necessarily going to be white. It very well could be black. So all we can do through the work of observation is kind of refine and hone our theories and eliminate alternative possibilities. But really what Popper put forth was a new principle of falsifiability. Science should proceed on the basis of what is falsifiable, and it can only proceed on the basis of what is falsifiable. So in this book, The Logic of Scientific Discovery, Popper criticized several disciplines which he thought could not conform to his principle of falsifiability. And amongst these were psychoanalysis and Marxism, which he referred to as pseudosciences because they couldn't conform to this principle. So you can see from the quote here what Popper has to say. I mean, the real problem that he's pointing out here is that the principles of psychoanalysis, or the concepts which psychoanalysis seems to operate under, allow it to explain things sort of retroactively, or it can always explain things in reference to a different concept that it has, in such a way that it doesn't have predictive power, or it doesn't have the possibility of being falsified, since it seems like it tries to fit everything into its framework or into its conceptual resources that it already has. So again, he criticized psychoanalysis as being pseudoscience, which, just to be clear, and I think this is an important distinction to make, is very different from saying that psychoanalysis was incorrect or that it was wrong or that it had been proven false. In fact, this is kind of an opposite claim, which is that it can't be proven false because it can't even submit itself to the standards of verification or of proof, or sorry, not of verification, but of falsifiability. So again, this was one of the most famous criticisms of Freud, and the reason I bring it up is because the logical positivists ended up having a pretty significant influence over the way in which philosophy was done in the United States. So as I mentioned, they were based out of Vienna, and like the Frankfurt School theorists, when World War II started, many of the people from the Vienna circle had to immigrate either to the UK, or many of them came over to America. And whereas the Frankfurt School theorists actually didn't get a lot of attention or didn't achieve a lot of fame in the United States, partly because of their Marxist leanings, which obviously weren't very popular during the 1940s. The logical positivists exercised an enormous influence over the way in which philosophy was done and continues to be done in the United States. So I mention this here in part because Popper's critique of Freud sort of traveled with the Vienna Circle and with the logical positivists over to the United States and basically eliminated any interest in Freudian psychoanalysis in American philosophy departments, and that continues to be the case today. But the story is quite different in Europe and continues to be different in Europe in large part because of this man, Jacques Lacan, who you may have come across in psychology courses, though my sense is that he's not particularly popular in mainstream psychology these days. But Lacan he's from France, was a French psychoanalyst He was trained as a psychiatrist and wrote his dissertation in 1932. So yeah, Lacan was one of the major figures of French psychoanalysis and has kind of become the touchstone figure of French psychoanalysis. He's equally, if not more famous than Freud, I think, in the French scene and the European scene more generally. Um, Lacan was, again, he was trained as a psychiatrist, but he spent a lot of time running in very different circles in the French intellectual scene. So he was hanging out with a lot of the surrealists like Salvador Dali and Pablo Picasso. And he actually was Picasso's analyst for a little while. He attended a number of very famous philosophy lectures during the time, and was hanging out with a number of philosophers. So Lacan was his work was heavily influenced by a number of different sources, not just psychiatry or psychoanalysis. Um, so from 1952 to 1980, Lacan conducted weekly seminars on Freud's works, in which he attempted to reread Freud's works. And I mean, he claimed that he was giving a more faithful reading of Freud, but I think in a lot of ways, contemporary scholars now seem to agree that Lacan was often offering his own spin on traditional Freudian works and offering kind of a new version of psychoanalytic thinking. These events were often like very well attended. So you can see from the photos, students are sitting on the floor. You have like a packed auditorium. This is Lacan here on the right in the bottom photo. But these were very popular and ran for a number of years and actually led to Lacan splitting off from the International Psychoanalytic Association and forming an association of his own. Just for the purposes of time, I won't talk too much about a lot of his major concepts, but the one place where you might be familiar with his work is from his work on the mirror stage. So he gave a talk to the International Psychoanalytic Association in 1949 titled "The Mirror Stage is Formative of the Eye Function." Lacan himself did not run the original mirror stage experiments. He was merely kind of commenting on the experiments as they had already been run. But in the mirror stage, Lacan thought he saw a way to reformulate Freud's concept of the superego. So he was particularly interested in the way in which it seemed as though children were able to recognize themselves in a mirror. And he claimed this gave some sort of evidence to the idea that children form their image of themselves in relation to some sort of external projection of that image. So he made some more speculative claims about how the mirror stage might be working throughout adult life, namely as a form of identification. So, Lacan's kind of fundamental claim in the mirror stage is that we never have kind of direct and immediate access to ourselves or to our own image. We're constantly constituting our self-image in relation to some sort of externalization which we see. And so this kind of applies in situations, for instance, in which we see an advertisement and we think to ourselves like, oh, I want to be like this person. That's kind of performing the same function as the mirror stage. Or perhaps we see a famous actor or actress, and we kind of we make this attempt to kind of behave or act in the same way as this person. These are all ways in which the mirror stage seems to be working in adult life as forming this sense of I or forming our ego. It's a way of describing the relationship between the ego and the superego, or the ideal ego, this mode of identification. So that's one way Lacan is kind of made himself known in psychology departments. Outside of that, he's sort of famous for his ways of debiologizing Freud's work and often offering a kind of linguistic spin on some of Freud's major concepts. So just to give a couple of examples, Lacan kind of rereads the Oedipal complex not as a problem that has to do with biological fathers and mothers, but really as a problem of dependency. So the Oedipal complex emerges when we recognize that children are dependent on an external figure. So that kind of forms the first part of the triangle. And then the person that they are dependent on is also dependent on another person. And so we get this kind of like three-way relationship in which there's dependency on all sides, and there's a kind of absence which seems to subtend all dimensions of the relationship. So he kind of rereads the Oedipal complex as a problem of dependency rather than as a real biological problem of mothers and fathers. Likewise, he reads the castration complex really as a problem of language. So castration is not really about being under the threat from the father of having your genitals taken away. He reads castration as a function of language. So children are born into a world that they don't understand, and they only receive language from outside, from the external world. And in this way, language seems to cut the subject off from itself because it forces people to express themselves in terms that are not their own. And he describes this as a kind of like metaphorical castration. Language seems to like cut through the subject and separate it off from its own sense of self, and kind of introduce something alien internal to the subject. So those are some of the examples of Lacan's rereading of Freud, and I bring him up here in part because he again exercised a tremendous influence over psychoanalysis in France, and also over philosophy in France, and was something of a celebrity figure. He had a huge personality, was very eccentric, and was very well known at the time. The next thing I'm going to move on to very briefly here are these French critiques of Freud and of Lacan. Again, like I mentioned, Lacan was really the major figure in France, and so many of these later French critics of psychoanalysis were in either one way or another responding to Freud or responding to Lacan's rereading of Freud. It became kind of standard practice that if you were going to criticize psychoanalysis after Lacan, you kind of had to criticize both Lacan and Freud. You couldn't just kind of go back to the original source material. And so some of the most famous people who did this were, in this top image, I have Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari. Deleuze was a philosopher. He was very traditionally trained as a philosopher and published some very standard philosophical works for which he's well known in philosophy spheres. But he had a collaborator, Guattari, who actually studied under Lacan in the 1950s. He was trained as a psychiatrist and was for some time practicing as a psychoanalyst. But eventually he made a split with Lacan, and he began working at this psychiatric clinic called Laborde, where he studied under Jean Horry. And Horry himself had also studied under Lacan, so you can get a sense of just how significant Lacan's influence was in France. But Laborde was kind of a special psychiatric clinic where many of the members, like Guattari and Horry, were interested in applying Marxist or anarchist principles to psychiatric work. So this clinic was mostly dealing with patients who had schizophrenia or other like major mood disorders. And the clinic was not a traditional model where you had clinicians and patients. They tried to reverse the roles and tried to undo the kind of hierarchies that stood between medical professionals and patients. So oftentimes the patients were doing a significant amount of work around the clinic. They occupied roles that they would not normally occupy. The clinicians did not try to wear uniforms and exercise control over the patients. And this was kind of done in the service of trying to, again, undo hierarchies and try to conform with like more anarchist principles in psychiatric work. Together, Deleuze and Guattari published this book in 1972 titled Anti-Oedipus, which was seen as one of the most devastating critiques of psychoanalysis in the French philosophy world. In it, they attempt to argue that psychoanalysis is in many ways a politically conservative way of treatment, that it's aligned in certain ways with principles of state control, that psychoanalysis has kind of achieved a level of political dominance in the French scene, as psychoanalysis was very popular, and they were often making very political arguments against kind of the hegemony that psychoanalysis had come to occupy in French culture. And so I actually took a class on this book last year. It's very long and it's a very difficult work, but it came to be seen as initiating this move in French philosophy away from psychoanalysis, and was kind of the beginning of psychoanalysis's decline in France. The other person who wrote a very influential text in French philosophy against psychoanalysis was Michel Foucault. So he's pictured here on the bottom. He's the man on the left. The person on the right is Noam Chomsky. They actually had a debate in 1971 on the question of human nature and whether something like an innate human nature exists. Foucault was also originally trained in both philosophy and psychiatry. And he, for most of his life, occupied instructor roles in psychology departments rather than philosophy departments, and actually interned at a psychiatric hospital. Like Guattari, he was originally very interested in psychoanalysis as a young student, but became kind of disenchanted with the movement later in his life. I've listed a number of texts he published here just to give you a sense of how deeply intertwined his work was with psychiatry and psychoanalysis. But this last text, History of Sexuality, which he published in 1976, was probably his most famous and was considered the most devastating critique of psychoanalysis. In it, he argues against Freud's concept of repression, arguing that, in fact, while Freud attempts to argue that sexuality is something that the psyche represses and sort of shoves down. This is not an accurate account of how sexuality functions in society. In fact, sexuality is talked about in all sorts of places. It's talked about in advertising, it's talked about in magazines, on TV. So he tried to argue that the repressive hypothesis was actually too simplistic of an account of sexuality. And unlike Herbert Marcuse, who thought that repression was really the problem that we were facing under capitalism, and that repression could be overcome and we could kind of flourish in this utopian society, Foucault thought there was a much more complicated picture to be told about sexuality, and that power and social control worked in more sophisticated ways than merely repression. So that was kind of his major critique. And Foucault is extremely popular in philosophy departments and also in other humanities departments. You may have heard of him. He continues to exercise quite a bit of influence over what's going on in philosophy departments these days. I'm going to try to wrap up the last two slides here pretty quickly because I realize I'm going over time. I'm actually writing on psychoanalytic feminism for my paper, so it's kind of unfortunate, but that is my own fault. I'll just briefly note in reference to psychoanalytic feminism that there are kind of two different strains of feminist work that has picked up on psychoanalytic themes. One continued on in France and continued responding to Freud and Lacan, and major figures in this movement included Irigaray, Kristeva, and Cixous. And there was a separate strain of feminists working in the United States and in the UK who were also interested in applying psychoanalytic concepts to feminist analysis. So these include Juliet Mitchell, Nancy Chodorow, Dorothy Dinnerstein, and Jessica Benjamin. One thing that these movements have in common is that they attempt to read Freud descriptively rather than prescriptively. So whereas Freud had, maybe given problematic accounts of normal development and normal sexual development, these theorists see some virtues to Freud's account of women's position. Specifically, they think that he's able to offer an account as to why patriarchy has come to be the dominant form of gender relations. And they're both of these movements are also interested in Freud's way of describing sexuality as neither reducible to biology nor reducible to social constructivism. So in the language of psychology, neither nature nor nurture, but as something which kind of operates at the intersection of biology and social construction. Again, another difference is that whereas the French version of psychoanalytic feminism tends to stick closely to the text of Freud and Lacan, Anglophone feminism has been much more grounded in Kleinian object relations theory, specifically because of Klein's return to the pre-Oedipal phase and her work on the mother-child relationship and the significant place she accords to mothering. So that's all I'll say about this, and I'll turn to my final slide, which is on kind of the contemporary state of psychoanalysis in philosophy departments. So as I've mentioned, kind of going through this presentation, psychoanalysis is not particularly popular in philosophy departments these days, in part because of the Karl Popper's critique and the way in which logical positivism spread in the United States, and then also because of the ways in which even the kind of French critics like Foucault and Deleuze and Guattari, had a pretty strong impact on the decline of psychoanalysis even in European philosophy. There are still a number of thinkers, though, in philosophy departments who are interested in psychoanalysis. By far the most famous is Slavoj Žižek. You may have heard of him just because he's published an insane amount of work. He's also made several movies, and the clip that I assigned in the reading is from this movie, The Pervert's Guide to Ideology. He also had a debate with Jordan Peterson last year, which I heard did not go particularly well. But yeah, he's kind of an eccentric personality as well. But Žižek is kind of engaged in a similar project that the Frankfurt School theorists were engaged in, which is trying to combine psychoanalytic theory with Marxism and trying to apply psychoanalytic concepts to political theorizing. And this I think is a kind of nice place to end because it's a good description of how psychoanalysis is still being used in philosophy departments, if it's being used at all, which is typically to give social or political critiques rather than to talk about clinical work in the way that psychoanalysis might be used in clinical psychology departments where it's still used. But typically, when people in philosophy departments have turned to Freud, it's been for political work. So in the clip I show in the reading, Zizek attempts to combine Marx's concept of fetishism, commodity fetishism, with Freud's concept of disavowal to give this account of cynical ideology, which he thinks is a better reformulation of Marx's original theory of ideology, which was the false consciousness picture. So I'll leave it at that, and perhaps you'll be able to tell me whether you think Zizek is successful in revising Marx's account or in applying Freudian psychoanalysis to political thinking. So yeah, I'll leave it off there. Thank you for watching.